So, welcome to the annual Theoretical Artist Theories video. I have to make one of these intellectual videos a year, so here's this year's. This video is a critique of political psychology and the concepts of right-wing and left-wing authoritarianism and the way that these concepts are currently being discussed and measured in political psychology. I should probably explain the reason I got into this was as part of a discussion group that I was doing on random like philosophy and stuff. The concept of right-wing authoritarianism came up and left-wing authoritarianism came up, and we did a reading on it. And I've been actually trying to get into a lot of different readings on philosophy for the past like few months and so on. And this one in particular by this guy Bob Altmaier, who has been doing research into right-wing authoritarianism for decades and decades. The reading frustrated me so much that I had to make a video on it. I'm just like, you know what? I'm going to make a video, which is weird because I didn't even actually disagree with it that much. But the things I disagreed with were just that critical. I really think like these points that I'm going to raise in this video are pretty important and ought to be raised more often. And they're clearly not being raised within the academic community on this stuff. So let me get into it here. I'm going to be reviewing two papers and Bob Altmaier's book, The Authoritarians, which this book is a summary of what I suppose the scientific consensus believes is right-wing versus left, like what is right-wing authoritarianism. This book summarizes a lot of the research that Bob Altmaier did over the past like decades, since like the 60s, I think. And it's important because, as far as I can tell, the chief understanding of authoritarianism within political psychology as a whole is right-wing authoritarianism. Left-wing authoritarianism is virtually, it's not discussed as much, and it's not analyzed as much, and it's definitely probably not measured as much. And then there's two papers on LWA that we're going to get into as well that try to get into that. Bob Altmaier's like, if there's articles on this guy, like if you ever hear about right-wing authoritarianism, chances are a lot of that information comes from people like Bob Altmaier. He's the one who developed this right-wing authoritarianism scale, which is not a political compass scale. It's its own scale that tries to measure, authoritarian personality traits in conjunction with right-wing views. And it's interesting because I feel like a lot of this stuff actually goes back to like the 50s, and I think almost goes back to World War II and the fascists, because from reading these papers and reading this book, I can get the sense that like this book here, The Authoritarian Personality, published in 1950, was like a big influence in shaping the sort of culture within political psychology on the topic of authoritarianism. After World War II, people were trying to figure out what created authoritarianism. How did the Nazis happen, essentially? And this goes into I'm speculating a little, but this gets to a narrative that I've kind of believed for a while, which is that we're feeling the after effects of World War II and the Nazis politically right now. A lot of what's happened and what we could call now, even what we could even call as like fascism paranoia, comes from the fact that the world experienced firsthand what right-wing authoritarianism is, what it looks like, what fascism was, and we're still reeling over it. That event, that drama has defined the outlook on this stuff. Now, before we jump into this, I want to make a few just introductory notes about the nature of political psychology. almost everything that these people that this field tries to measure is measured with survey data and questionnaires. The implicit question that might come up is, what do these questionnaires really even predict? Okay, in order to prove that their tests have some sort of meaning, a lot of what they do is actually try to argue that they correlate with other things and that they predict certain things. For example, even in this LWA paper, what they argue is how voting or how people who score high in their LWA end up voting against Trump or having a perceived threat of Trump or something like that. And I just want to make a note. I'm gonna talk probably a lot about this idea, but it's like, just because a scale predicts something doesn't make that thing good or bad. Like the idea that an LWA, if you score high on an LWA scale and that predicts that you wouldn't vote for Trump, that doesn't mean that voting for Trump is good or bad, just because high LWAs would or wouldn't do it. And that's the point, right? Tests, they need to have that in there because they need to show that the scale actually shows something. It's not just words. So they try to show that it predicts some type of voting behavior or some type of other behavior. Typically, it's behavior on other scales and other tests. And that gets to the, I guess, a more principled question, which is like, what does any of this even mean? I've been, thinking critically about political compass tests for like a few years now. I'm just thinking, like, what do these tests even really show? They're ways of measuring certain beliefs, but are they ways of arguing that these beliefs are right and wrong? Well, they are and they aren't. In a sense, you have to kind of see it from both angles. You have to imagine the right-wing authoritarianism, left-wing authoritarianism. You have to imagine these compasses and these tests and these scales as showing something from a neutral angle, because it's science. It's not trying to take a moral position. On the other hand, the morality of this is implicit because, and Altmaier himself emphasizes in this book, he's not just describing what right-wing authoritarians are like, he's attacking them. He's making a point. He's showing with scale after scale and construct after construct why this personality type is problematic. And that's kind of what, how that's kind of how it works. Just the RWA scale seems to predict almost immoral behavior. And that in and of itself should be reason not to trust any scale. If there's a scale out there that predicts how moral you are, chances are you probably shouldn't trust that scale, even if you agree with what it's saying is immoral. But there's a very palpable implicit message within, at least with Altmaier's book here, that right-wing authoritarianism is wrong. Not just that this is what it is, but that it's wrong, and that you should be aware that it's wrong, and that it's a threat to democracy, and so on and so forth. The other thing to think about that Altmaier never ever mentions is the difference between psychology and ideology. You can look at any political compass test, any psychometric test, especially in the context of this, and be like, well, is this measuring psychology or is this measuring ideology? I imagine that psychologists have to deal with this question all the time. They have to deal with the difficulty of being like, well, we're not measuring something that's psychological. We're measuring something that's just, an idea. If people believe in an idea, then what does psychology have to do with it? It's not psychology. It's an opinion. It's an ideology, right? You can have any opinion, supposedly. But then it gets tricky because it's like, well, certain opinions might come from certain psychologies, right? Certain psychologies might lead to certain opinions. And maybe even vice versa through through epigenetics or something. Maybe certain opinions and ideologies somehow influence parts of your psychology and shift your personality somehow. It gets into a, chicken and egg type thing. What actually matters more, psychology or ideology? It's not an easy thing to answer. I don't think there is a clean answer. But what definitely is the case is it's important to be aware of the difference. I want to make it clear to anyone who ever looks at this book and looks at this research that there is a difference between psychology and ideology. You can disagree with every single, you can disagree on every single item on the RWA scale, and that's an element of your ideology, not an element of your psychology, and vice versa, right? And you can agree with any element and argue for it ideologically, and that argument does not, the ideological component to the debate of whether, the right-wing positions or the left-wing positions or whatever they are, has and should have nothing to do with psychology at a certain point, And and this gets relevant if you look at some of the things on this scale. Like, if you disagree with them or if you agree with them, you should understand that agreement or disagreement is not contingent purely on psychology. Even if the psychologists are saying, because they are sort of saying, well, belief in these things means you score high on a scale, and it's not good to score high on this scale. It doesn't matter from perspective of philosophy or from perspective of dialectics, because dialectically you have the right to argue any position, right? And psychology, you need to be psychologized in order to make that argument. The argument should stand on its own, so to speak. And that's why I had such a frustrating time reading this book, because the concerns between ideology versus psychology should be important to anyone, because if you've ever had any political debates with anyone, you should know that you get psychologized when people disagree with you all the time. So the fact that Altmaier writes a whole book psychologizing people he disagrees with, and he never even mentions the complexity of ideology versus psychology, is kind of disappointing, to say the least. Because there is a difference, and ultimately I'd make the point that you can argue for any item on this scale, any single item, and you would be wrong too if you did, but you could argue for them, and it needn't be a empirical measure of your psychology necessarily. So let's get into the RWA scale after that long disclaimer. I want to say that I actually generally agree with the picture of right-wing authoritarians that Altmaier draws. And he does do a good job of drawing a very lengthy, elaborate picture of these people. He succeeds. I know this from personal experience because I've dealt with people who I would consider right-wing authoritarians. I've noticed right-wing authoritarian behavior and personality types in my own family. But I can definitely relate to that part. So I definitely think the overall picture is accurate. What's inaccurate and what's frustrating about this book is the framing of the discussion of right-wing authoritarianism relative to the overall political situation. And we'll get into that a bit later. But the overall appearance of the right-wing authoritarian personality type does appear to match experiential reality. He goes at length to explain the connection between right authoritarianism and religion, religious fundamentalism. He talks about the difference between authoritarian followers and authoritarian leaders, and how the followers have this desire to submit. He talks about cognitive rigidity and compartmentalized thinking and all of these different things that these kind of avert noticeable, I don't want to say dysfunctions, but noticeable kind of like errors in thought that you can observe in certain these kinds of people. You can see these things play out in everyday situations. You can, and not just in the context of politics. The traits that are described in these chapters absolutely go beyond that. They go into everyday things, just experiences when it comes to new information. High RWA scale people, I imagine, would have a very hard time dealing with any kind of new information. And there's a certain thing here that's also kind of, that I want to emphasize that Altmaier never touches on, but it's this like, it's this like unimaginativeness that some of these people have. There's this habit, so to speak, of, how do I explain this? It's like when I'm thinking or when I'm talking to someone, I try not to make an assumption about I try not to make an assumption about why they're doing something or what they're doing or who they are, or like it's weird. It's like someone made a decision in a game, or someone took a left turn on the road, or it's small things, little things, like just, everyday little actions that people do. I try not to assume why a person does certain things. There could be all sorts, or at the very least, I try to keep in mind the reasons that a person might have for doing certain things. That there might be all sorts of reasons for and against doing all kinds of little things, like wearing that particular article of clothing or that one, or cleaning this part of the house versus that one, or, maybe I'm not making myself very clear, but I'm talking about small kind of decisions. But what I notice about RWAs is that RWAs seem to make assumptions about why people do those things, and they're not aware that these even are assumptions. RWAs seem to just, they act and speak as if they know why a certain decision is made by another person without ever asking the question. They seem to, it's like they're not imagining the possibilities that are present in reality. They're imagining a narrow kind of set of explanations and borrowing from that narrow set rather than imagining a larger set. And then that's the kind of source of the rigidity itself that Altmaier talks about, right? It's this like unimaginativeness. It's this inability to imagine possibilities in everyday things. Now, to be fair, it's easy to do that. It's easy to miss possibilities, but and it's also it weighs on you cognitively to have to imagine all the possibilities. But with RWAs, there's definitely a thing of not being able to imagine possibilities and not being aware that you're not able to imagine them. Anyway, the other thing that I like about this book is this chapter 5 section where he describes authoritarian leaders. I definitely think the authoritarian leader thing is measured with another scale called the social dominance scale. And the social dominance scale sounds kind of similar to what you might find on like some dark triad psychological questionnaires, or something to do with, something trying to measure like sociopathy. But the social dominance scale, the difference between authoritarian followers and leaders is also, I think, very like, it matches my own experiential reality. So I know that it's serious. The difference between followers and leaders is that it's kind of interesting, because it's like leaders don't believe any of their own principles at all. Followers do, but followers don't notice their own hypocrisy, whereas the leaders just don't care. And it creates this kind of this toxic fraternity between them, where followers will submit to the leaders thinking that they're in pursuit of some type of good, whereas the leaders are just selfish people who don't care. You can absolutely see this in right-wing authoritarian leadership in positions of power. You can see this in characters like Donald Trump. There's a very real sense that some of these powerful authoritarian figures that can be called right-wing don't have any morals whatsoever, but their followers don't seem to notice or don't seem to care. And it's interesting, because while I've argued many times that the left has a blind spot for certain kinds of, the left has all sorts of blind spots for like cluster B personality disorders and other kinds of like moral defects within people that can create authoritarianism or some type of problem. This is the blind spot on the right. The blind spot on the right is to put it simply, like the left has a blind spot towards BPD, the right has a blind spot towards narcissism. The right adores authoritarian leaders because it adores this idea that the authoritarian leader is the good guy. But like, it's very, it obviously is an inversion of that idea when the authoritarian leader isn't the good guy, but they're framing themselves as the good guy because their followers will believe anything they say. So I definitely think chapter 5 is good too. But that's where and in chapter 6 he like tries to draw connections between, he looks at all this evidence comparing Republican politicians in the United States and showing how high their RWA scores are. But that's where that's where my praise of the book ends. I found this book incredibly frustrating to read, all things considered, even though I think it's generally accurate at a face value level. There's a lot of problems with the overall picture drawn by this book, okay? Number one, just to get this out of the way, the problem with this book starts with the way Altmaier himself writes it. This book does not have, it's not written in a very intellectually thorough way. It's written in a very jokey sort of fashion. It almost comes across, one of my friends said, it comes across like someone's lecture notes rather than someone trying to have a serious discussion. I'm not going to get to examples of that. There's plenty of them if you read the book. Even look at pieces of it. There's examples of... It's not an issue of someone just making jokes when they write, but there's just nonstop trying to joke about the subject matter where, you could have just spent time trying to get into it deep. The other annoying thing is that he doesn't ever go into too much detail about the experiments, because this is, to be fair, this is a book that's written for non-intellectuals. This is a book that's written for lay people. It briefly goes over the research and he talks about it, but he talks about it, summarily. He summarizes the research that he does. It's annoying because then you can't scrutinize it unless you go look for the actual papers that he wrote and look at what's in those papers, which I'm not going to have time to do. But for example, a great example of this is the global change game stuff. In this book, they talk about a psychological test where they had they had participants do, essentially Model UN style game where everyone plays a country or a region and they have to solve world issues. There's very little contextualization of that game. There's so many things you could scrutinize from a research perspective on what the nature of that game was and what insights are being gleaned out of it. But he doesn't mention any of that because this book isn't written for researchers. It's written for lay people. So that's just a thing. I don't know. It's just a little annoying. Compared to most of the things I've read, this is further down as far as trying to be simplified for the lay audience, and it makes it hard to scrutinize some of the actual insights. Okay, so that's issue number one. Next, let's get into the actual RWA scale. So I have it right here in front of me. The way that this works is that the first two items you actually ignore, and the rest of the scale is weighted in accordance to a specific weighting system that's up here. That part doesn't matter. The point is, just take a look at some of the items on this scale as I'm scrolling through. Our country needs a desperate, mighty leader who will do what has to be done to destroy the radical new ways of sinfulness that are ruining us. Gays and lesbians, etc., etc. Then you have things like this. Atheists and others who have rebelled against established religions are no doubt every bit as good and virtuous as those who attend church regularly. We're going to have to get into... I'm going to have to start carving this chicken right now. So, the thing that anyone who's on the right, who thinks about this stuff, wants to defend themselves and doesn't want to come across as an RWA, and anyone who wants to scrutinize Altmaier will say, it's very clear that this scale does not try to separate right-wing from right-wing authoritarian. It doesn't even try. And Altmaier doesn't even try. And nowhere in this book, and I've read the whole book, does he even explain that. It's kind of sad. So atheists and others, you could argue that this is an item that indicates authoritarianism, but this is also an item that depends on religious belief. And religious belief is ideological. And this goes back to the ideology versus psychology thing. If you're someone who's religious, you might in general disagree with this item. You might in general not believe atheists are as virtuous as religious people. And if you're an atheist, you might think the reverse. So the fact that this is on here should be suspicious, because it's is this measuring authoritarianism or is this measuring an ideology? And then that gets into another question, which is authoritarianism itself something that exists in a way that's ideologically independent? Is there even such a thing as ideologically independent authoritarianism? These are all super fucking interesting questions, and I will point out that the LWA papers get into them in detail. They don't come to any good conclusions, but they get into them. Altmaier doesn't even try to discuss them. So, and I don't know if he's even, I mean, he's a researcher. He's probably thought of them at least once, I hope, somewhere in his other papers, but like, certainly not in this book. Then there's this item. Yeah, there's absolutely nothing wrong with nudist camps. So I get why this is here. The reason this is here is because this is trying to signal the conformity and conventionalism side of RWA thinking. But at the same time, you can think of all kinds of other perhaps reasons that have nothing to do with that might just be why someone doesn't like nudist camps. I don't know. Maybe they think nudist camps are gross or something, or they see videos of weird things that, you know, people do in those camps. I don't know. The thing is you to think that an item like this is cross-loaded with other ideological factors, not necessarily authoritarianism. Here's another one. You have to admire those who challenge the law and the majority's view by protesting women's abortion rights, for animal rights, or to abolish school prayer. So, like, again, is this authoritarianism or is this just right-wingism? Because if you have beliefs against each and every one of these particular movements, those beliefs influence your rating of the scale, right? Your answer to this item, right? Not where does authoritarianism come in? Once again, this provokes my earlier question. What is the difference between authoritarianism and ideology? Right? Perhaps authoritarianism itself is an ideology, and you can come up with ideologically sound or, you know, ideological grounds for defending authoritarianism in general. But the difference between, clearly nonetheless, you'd say that there's a difference between an item like this and an item like this, where this item 14, what our country really needs is a strong, determined leader who will crush evil and take us back to our true path. This is clearly signaling authoritarianism. Like, there's no question. This is all about authority. Authority itself is being, like, the concept of authority is being procced in the sentence. It's not being procced here. This is just asking about certain movements. Authority is not, like, there's no language regarding authority itself. Some of the best are those who are trying to challenge our government, criticizing religion, etc., etc., etc. And you can get into those. Oh yeah, a woman's place is wherever she wants to be. The days where women are submissive to their husbands, social conventions should be strictly passed. Again, not necessarily. I mean, this is implicitly authoritarian, in women should submit to the authority of their husbands, but it's not authoritarian in a larger kind of government sense. Here's another one. Homosexuals and feminists should be praised for being brave enough to defy traditional family values. Once again, if you agree with traditional family values, then you will disagree with this item, and you will have a lower score on this particular item. This does not, once again, this item does not ask questions pertaining directly to authoritarianism. Like, if you just disagree with feminism, I mean, if you have a criticism of feminism, it makes me wonder whether Altmaier understands or even imagines that there could be reasons to disagree with feminism that have nothing to do with RWA. Now, this gets into another discussion, which you have to keep in mind with these kinds of psychological questionnaires, is that an item can be cross-loaded with all sorts of psychological, ideological factors driving the answer, but the collection of items itself may not be cross-loaded. In other words, that even if there's an item like item 21 is cross-loaded with all sorts of values and things that have nothing to do with RWA, the fact that item 21 in conjunction with all of these other items, on average, those effects will vanish in a large enough sample size, is the idea, right? So there's that argument. People who want to defend the scale could always point to that and say, like, well, you know, there are certain items that don't make any sense. Even if there's items that are cross-loaded, the overall is not that cross-loaded. Nonetheless, you could argue that some of these items don't necessarily measure authoritarianism straightforwardly and should be scrutinized. And what they do in the LWA paper is they actually do just that. It's kind of amazing to me going from reading Altmaier to reading this, because all of my issues, almost all of them from reading Altmaier, were addressed in this paper. The paper not only did it get rid of items that felt like they were too cross-loaded with ideology, it only left in items like this and administered that version of the RWA scale. And then it did another thing, which is also just insane when I get to it, and I'll explain what that is. But yeah, so you have to keep in mind that there's going to be a huge difference between like RWA and RW. Sorry, you have to keep in mind that there may be a difference between RWA and RW. RWA is trying to measure something beyond mere right wing. And Altmaier himself definitely knows this, because he says in the book that in politics you need a mixture of progressive and conservative opinions. So he's not anti-RW, he's anti-RWA. But nonetheless, then you have to at least emphasize that there's some type of difference between those things. What disappoints me about the book as a whole is that he never even addresses that in the discussion. He just talks about RWA like it's this given measure that perfectly measures authoritarianism in and of itself and is not cross-loaded with any other type of trait or psychological or ideological thing. And that's what's amazing about the LWA paper, is that both of these papers know to do just that. They control for ideology before looking at RWA and LWA scores. Who would have thunk? Imagine doing that. Imagine actually controlling for ideology. Now, granted, the effect is still there. Even if when you control for ideology, you're still going to probably see that people who score highly on the RWA scale are going to behave in a certain way, and that part's accurate, but the effect is offset by the difference between ideology, between the ideology and the RWA, the authoritarian psychology itself. What am I going to do next? There's another thing here. Yes, authoritarian realism. There's a thing you also have to keep in mind, which is that, and the myth of LWA paper tries to address this a little bit, but authoritarianism may not be a psychological concept that can exist independent of some ideology. In other words, there may not be such a thing as authoritarianism proper in and of itself outside of right wing or left wing, in that all authoritarianism is authoritarianism relative to some authority. It's an interesting question. It's not obvious. I don't think these papers are literally from like most recent times, so there's no way that they know yet whether authoritarianism as a concept exists on its own outside of any ideology, or whether it's only something that emerges in an ideologically contingent fashion. But even in both cases, you still clearly have a concept of both RWA and LWA as things to measure and look at. And both of those things have some degree of symmetry. The other thing, and then the other big criticism I have of Altmaier is that he never really talks about LWA at all. He mentions it a few times, and he gets into what LWAs might support, like crazy revolutions and stuff like that. He mentions them briefly, but he primarily focuses entirely on right-wing authoritarianism, which really, this title is a misname. This isn't the Authoritarians, this is the right-wing authoritarians. Even calling it this just implicitly misleads people into thinking that authoritarianism itself is right-wing. And I guess that's the fundamental fucking issue, isn't it? Altmaier likely thinks, and much of the literature and much of the science probably thinks, that authoritarianism itself is right-wing. I'm here to say that that's just fucking not true. Authoritarianism is not fundamentally right-wing. You could, again, go back to that point as like, if there is such a thing as authoritarianism that's not ideologically contingent at all, but at the very least, left-wing authoritarianism is as valid as right-wing authoritarianism as a concept, and it's as relevant to our present political moment. The idea that authoritarianism is a fundamentally right-wing concept is just bullshit. And the sloppiness with which this book was written, and the kind of obvious criticisms and obvious questions you could ask in scrutiny of the construct not even being addressed, just further proves my point. And it's doubly the case because it seems, and the LWA papers try to emphasize the fact that Altmaier himself is probably much of the reason why the left-wing authoritarianism construct is ignored in the field. Why there's maybe he's not the only reason, but his RWA scale is essentially, there's a scientific consensus that it's what defines authoritarianism. His scale is used all the time. These papers go into detail about how much Bob Altmaier's RWA scale is used and how much it predicts. So the scale is definitely useful and that's good, but it's not the only thing in the equation. And the problem is dealt with the fact that Altmaier himself constructed an LWA scale, which somehow showed that there were almost no LWAs. But as we're going to find out when we get into the LWA paper, the reason for that is the way he drew up the LWA scale. The LWA scale was not drawn up properly. It was not written in a way that was symmetrical. Now, the funny thing is, if you're curious, by the way, as to what my score on the scale was, I scored about an 80. The scale goes from 20 to 180. 80, I think like 100 is the midpoint. So I think I was either like 80 or 90, but I'm slightly below the midpoint in the scale. So if you're curious, annoyingly, Altmaier never tells us what his score is on the scale, which I find just amusing. I'm just going to go over a few quotes in the RWA paper that I just don't agree with before we jump ship, because this shit could take forever. The thing is, there's a lot of things you could nitpick. Like I said, I found this book so frustrating because of how many things you could nitpick. I'm not going to go into anything. I'm just going to go over like a few things that I thought were pretty interesting. Let's go to page 85. There's a free speech thing. Okay, so he goes into this test about free speech and free speech hypocrisy on the right, and he talks about how high RWAs are interested in censoring opinions they dislike, not interested in censoring opinions, and against censorship when it's opinions that they like. No surprise there. I wouldn't be surprised there. But he makes the claim that low RWAs just aren't like that. This is the quote here. It turned out to be no context because in both studies, authoritarian followers wanted to impose more censorship in all of these cases, save the one involving the sex education, who strongly believed all premarital sex. Oh, actually, no. The authoritarian personalities want to impose more censorship in general. How can this be? It happened because lows seldom want to censor anyone. They apparently believe in freedom of speech, even when they detest the speech. Some low RWAs may insist on political correctness, but the great majority seemingly do not. I do not trust this, and you should not trust this assessment whatsoever of low RWAs. For one, this is an issue of framing. The implication is that anyone who's not high in RWA, anyone who's low RWA is going to be is going to be anti-censorship. That's not necessarily true. The other thing is, this book was written in 2006. This may have been before we were seeing significant, noticeable political correctness and censorship from the left. I would say that you could argue that that low RWAs didn't care about censorship or weren't trying to censor. The other thing is, low RWA does not mean left wing. Low RWA just means not RWA. In other words, this could be capturing centrists, independents, anyone who's just not conservative. There's a difference between not being conservative and being left-wing. I doubt that you would see the same results if you measured people who were high in LWA. And I'm pretty sure that, in this study, they definitely find that there is a positive correlation between top-down censorship and left-wing authoritarianism. Who would have freaking thunk? So that insight completely contradicts this nonsense. The other thing you have to keep in mind is how the framing of the question works. You have to remember that in the case of RWA, their hypocrisy may be more easily noticeable than the hypocrisy of LWAs or people who are pro-censorship. You have to remember, because when they're answering questions on a questionnaire, they might say that they're, in favor of free speech and against censorship. But That might be on a questionnaire. It might not be the same thing in real life. In other words, imagine the following example, right? A lot of left-wingers, when you talk to them, they'll say that they're in favor of free speech. Free speech is pretty important. Now, they'll defend free speech like crazy when it's, their freedom of speech. But then what ends up happening when there's an issue of censorship, someone is being censored, some comedian is being censored because a bunch of people, because maybe they made a comedy special where they made a transphobic remark, and trans activists are now upset about this, and they're going to petition and try to protest at Netflix to get the comedian's special to be banned. What left-wingers see when they see that situation is not an issue of censorship. They see it as an issue of a infringed upon oppressed group protesting for rights and fighting for its rights. That's what they see. They don't see it as an issue of speech. They'll see it as an issue of speech when you frame it to them as an issue of speech on paper. They might see it as an issue of speech there. It doesn't mean that that's how it's going to be in the real world. That being said, though, it is still strange because, like, a lot of these questions would, they do come across as openly anti-free speech and pro-censorship. So the fact that low RWAs in general say that they're pro-free speech, I guess it still should mean something. But then my explanation to this would be the fact that these low RWAs are not the same thing as high LWAs. High LWAs are either, if they're answering that they're on these scales, that they're in favor of free speech, they're just lying or they're just not, somehow the questionnaire itself is biasing their answer from what it would actually be in the real world if there was an issue of speech. The real thing is that issues of speech aren't framed as issues of speech when they end up manifesting in political reality. Okay, so I just wanted to cover that. The next one is page 176. I feel like I forgot some point I was going to make about that speech thing, but it could also be the case because, like, once again, low RWAs is a much larger set of people than LWAs. Could also be that people's left-wing views are not being, I guess, activated, or their desire for political correctness is not being prompted by the questions somehow. Anyway, here's this other quote. This is the section where he talks about social dominators and the authoritarian leaders. Now, he talks about the soundness of their thinking hardly means you can believe them. However, they are quite capable of saying whatever will get them ahead. After all, they hold there's no such things as right and wrong. It all boils down to what you can say and get away with. Now, one of the most useful skills a person should develop, they say, is how to look someone straight in the eye and lie convincingly. He's talking about not RWA followers, but high RWA leaders, social dominators. Now, the reason I bring this up, and this is important, because in the context of philosophy, people who don't believe in right and wrong, this is the exact same thing as moral relativists and moral subjectivists. All right, moral subjectivists and moral relativists also believe that there's no such thing as right and wrong. They just believe in it differently. Maybe they believe implicitly that right and wrong is, right and wrong. Believing in right and wrong is wrong if they're relativists, after all. I just find it interesting that Altmaier has this here because this is a form of moral objectivism that can clearly also exist on the left, because you're going to probably find more moral relativists and subjectivists on that side, but there's no he doesn't address that potential source of immorality. I mean, presumably in the context of psychology, ideological psychology, people who are moral relativists would also not believe in such a thing as right and wrong. And that could also perhaps contribute to real immoral behavior. It's just weird that, like, we're going to look at not believing in right and wrong as like a real measure of something within psychology, but then when moral relativists talk about not believing right and wrong, it's totally cool because it's a philosophical position or something like that. Page 202. The reason this right and wrong thing is interesting as well, in page 202, he talks about he talks about RWA scales for American legislators. And on top of the RWA scales, he asks them all of these other questions to see how they correlate with RWA. And one of the questions is this, one of the items rather, have a we were the good guys, the Soviets were the bad guys view of the Cold War. So not having a view of right and wrong apparently doesn't apply to something like the Cold War. In the Cold War, everyone is equally wrong. He says earlier in the book that he understands that I'm not saying the Soviets were the good guys, but this to me comes across, as someone whose entire multiple generations of family came from the Soviet Union. This to me sounds like liberal Western garbage. This is just someone not understanding what the Soviet Union was. That's what this comes across as. Whether conservatives have the right reason for hating the Soviet Union and seeing the conflict between the US and the Soviet Union in a black and white sort of way, even if they're doing it for the wrong reason, they are still correct in the answer. Let me reframe this, by the way. I mean, are you saying that right and wrong only applies in what? It doesn't apply to nations? Nations can't ever be right and wrong? So when there's a conflict between two nations, it's not the case that one is right and one is wrong? Why not? What if you replace Cold War with World War II and you replace Soviets with Nazi Germany? Well, clearly there's good and bad in that context, but I would argue that this is the same thing, too. The Soviets were probably accurate to say every bit as bad as Nazi Germany. They also killed millions of their own people, just along slightly different ideological lines. The idea that seeing America in its conflicts with other nations is an inherently authoritarian thing is annoying because it ignores the facts of those events and the facts of those wars. And see, that's the thing. This item depends on actual facts, facts of history, facts relating to these conflicts, not necessarily how is it an issue of psychology. At that point, it's not an issue of psychology at all. No. This is, again, I'm sure psychologists have to deal with shit like this all the time because any scale can be cross-loaded with a million different things. But I just want to make the point that at least as far as my narrative is concerned, it's clear. Things like this make me feel that Altmaier has what we can call a left-wing bias. And this bias manifests in items like we were the good guys, Soviets were the bad guys, as if this is an implication of anything other than an awareness of fact. Next, there's this other issue here. He also brings up, oppose a law requiring affirmative action and state hiring that could give priority to qualified minorities until they get caught up. So, obviously, it's going to be Republicans that oppose affirmative action. The thing about this, though, is that you're acting like there are no arguments against affirmative action, as if affirmative action is something that everyone has just always agreed with. I don't think that's true. I think there's plenty of arguments you can come up with against affirmative action, and people have. Thus, this is cross-loaded with legitimate ideological concerns and not necessarily a measure of authoritarian psychology. So, once again, it comes back to that. This is a piece of evidence that leads me to the speculation that Altmaier has, whether he is aware of it or not, some type of liberal bias. It doesn't have to be a very strong liberal bias or left-wing bias. It's a bias. It could be a very subtle bias. I don't think he's a communist or anything like that. That part's pretty clear. He discusses his political views like earlier in the book, and he calls himself an independent, and he talks about how he disagrees with the left himself. But it doesn't seem to matter. Just because, when I say someone has a left-wing bias, I don't necessarily mean that they're freaking mouth-frothing, hammer and sickle sporting communists. I'm just saying they have a bias somewhere in their ideology, somewhere in their view. And here the bias manifests in all sorts of things, probably an assumption about what authoritarianism is as a concept, to the point of thinking that authoritarianism is an intrinsically right-wing thing. If I had to guess as to what his bias was, it would be that, as well as the fact that he seems to just have a uncritical attitude towards certain typically left-wing positions and affirmations. All right. I think there's one more. There's one more. Oh, yes. There's one more section I want to go to. Page 207. Here we go. So this is again talking about RWA scales for politicians. Right here, although the right-wing and right-wing authoritarianism refers to a psychological trait that endorses submission to established authority, see Chapter 1, not a political ideology, the RWA scale finds different levels of this trait in politicians from the two parties. He's just talking about measuring RWA scores for Republicans, but this sentence is pure bullshit. And I remember when I read this, I actually I had to grab my fucking hair, because I was like, how do you unironically write this? He's saying that it's a psychological trait. As I've already explained, it's obviously not just a psychological trait. There's all sorts of things on that scale that you could just debate as a matter of ideology. There's things on that scale regarding abortion. Abortion is an issue of ideology. It's not an issue of psychology. It's not. Well, maybe it is somehow deep down, but you can. There are arguments you can come up with in philosophy for and against abortion. There are arguments you can come up with for and against feminism. And every single item on that, well, not every single item, but for some of those items. So the fact that he would unironically just assert that his scale only measures psychology, and as you know, watching 50 minutes of this video now, you know that my chief criticism of Altmaier is that he doesn't even address the difference between psychology and ideology anywhere in this fucking book. The fact that he asserts this like this so freely makes me think that he wasn't even thinking when he wrote this. It makes me think that this is so simplified and dumbed down that you almost shouldn't take any of it seriously. Of course, the fucking RWA scale measures something beyond just psychology. Of course ideology is intermixed. And of course it's your fucking job to control for that. And nowhere in the book does he do that. Even though the LWA papers both go out of their way to do that. They both control for left-wing ideology before giving people LWA scales. And I don't know why he even said this, man. This is so stupid. This is so stupid. Just from a position of clarity. It just shows that it makes you think, makes me speculate again, that Altmaier just didn't care to be wrong about this. He thought, authoritarianism is right-wing deep down, and this is all accurate. And that pretty much comes down to, that pretty much sums up my issues with Altmaier. Fundamentally, the difference between ideology and psychology not even being addressed in the book is the truly most suspicious thing. I don't care. You can be against this scale in every single term for ideological reasons, but don't tell me that the scale measures psychology in and of itself. I think you would have to be deluded to think that, or you'd have to be so presumptuous about your own ideological positions and the inherent truth of them, that you wouldn't even think that any of the items on here might be ideologically dependent at all. That's just absurd. It's amazing. It's amazing. This is what I was thinking. For 200 pages, what I was thinking is how do you even write 200 pages in a book and never even address the potential ideological reasons someone might have for scoring highly on this scale? It's amazing. Anyway, well, let's move on to this paper now. One of the things I dislike about the word authoritarianism as well is that the word authoritarianism doesn't necessarily have an ethical meaning. Its meaning depends on how we define it. You can define authoritarianism in a way where its meaning is neutral, ethically speaking. It is ethically neutral meaning. So, for example, listening to an authority that's correct. This paper, by the way, makes it clear that an important aspect of authoritarianism is its authoritarianism to what? Is that authoritarianism will always look at specific domains. It's a domain-specific type of construct. So, if it's domain-specific, then everyone is an authoritarian to some degree, right? It's more like authoritarianism is not an extreme in any sort of way, but rather a capacity or a faculty of the mind and of one's psychology to defer to some authorities and not others. Now, in that sense, the word authoritarian is actually just neutral. It's like whether I'm deferring to police or government authorities or the CDC in COVID or scientific authorities, whoever I'm deferring to some authority, then I'm an authoritarian automatically. But by that logic, everyone's an authoritarian, and that brings me to authoritarian realism. I am to some degree an authoritarian realism. I don't believe in a system of zero authority. I think the reality is that we always listen to some authority. It's just that authority depends, it's domain specific. We don't listen to any authority. We don't listen to every authority for no reason. We challenge authority some of the time, but we also need authority because ultimately, authority is part of the way that things end up being structured. So the notion of authority doesn't have to be an ethically negative one. Nonetheless, when we use the word authoritarian doesn't just mean you employ the faculty of obeying and deferring to authority when it's reasonable. The word authoritarian isn't talking about the faculty. The word authoritarian is talking about some extreme form of deference. In our colloquial kind of common understanding of authoritarian, that's what it means. When you call someone authoritarian, you are not just saying that this person employs a faculty of the mind. You are saying this person is somehow wrong or bad, that they are somehow causing harm or that they are causing a limitation of freedom, right? It's a serious moral charge. And it's, like I said, the ethics in Altmaier's book are unambiguous. Nonetheless, this paper makes a much better claim and makes it clear that authoritarianism is domain specific, and thus authoritarianism doesn't even have to be an ethically negative measure of something. Authoritarianism can be an ethically neutral measure of something. Nonetheless, I think authoritarianism, the word can have two different meanings. Most of the time when we're talking about it in the ethically negative sense. And when you're trying to measure it, when Altmaier's trying to measure it, he obviously thinks of it in the ethically negative sense. Although I think that it's possible to also measure it in the ethically neutral sense. And in the ethically neutral sense, the ethically neutral sense would be one that we're less interested in. I think the point of all of this research is to find out what authoritarianism is in and of itself, because authoritarianism is fundamentally seen as a type of measure of evil. Ever since the fascists, authoritarianism is one of the chief, yardsticks for measuring political evil. But nonetheless, I just make that point because it's important to know that in conceptual reality, there is a difference between the socially charged meaning where it's ethically negative versus the empirically sound meaning where it's neutral. Let's go through some of the quotes in the LWA paper. So yes, the LWA paper talks about Altmaier and how Altmaier said that LWA persons are as rare as hen's teeth in my samples. The first thing this paper does is it criticizes Altmaier's understanding of LWA and the scale that he used to measure LWA. First, Altmaier's LWA scale requires participants who score high on the questionnaire to support a revolution to overthrow the established government. In fact, 20 of the 22 items on Altmaier's LWA scale reference a revolutionary movement. For example, the member of the establishment deserved to be dealt with harshly without mercy, etc., etc. By contrast, none of the items on Altmaier's RWA scale make a single reference to violent upheavals and overthrowing the establishment. See, Altmaier would probably think that the reason for this is because, right-wingers don't support upheavals, right? They support further reinforcement of the establishment. That depends. It's whether they think the establishment that's whether the right-wingers think the establishment upholds their values or not. In the case of abortion, they actually do support a violent upheaval. They would support getting rid of laws that are defending abortion, right? Yeah, so this is the first thing. He doesn't have a symmetrical he didn't construct a symmetrical LWA scale. So I've already shit on Altmaier a bit here, but We can scroll, actually, one second here. I'm going to go to page 8, actually. This is the big thing. Not only does he not talk about the difference between ideology and psychology, not only does he ignore all of this discussion about, the nature of, ideology and authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is a double-barreled construct because it contains both ideological and authoritarian content. It can be a challenge to disentangle the degree that LWA effects are the result of authoritarianism or the result of ideology. Wow. Look at all of that sense. Where was that in the political psychology research from the past, 4 decades? I wonder. Because all of this stuff appears to be recent. Authoritarianism is almost certainly expressed in primarily domain-specific ways, and as a result, all authoritarianism questionnaires must in some sense answer the question, authoritarianism to what? Yes. Yes, absolutely. Because like I said, this paper is written from a perspective of authoritarian realism. There is an authoritarian faculty in everyone. And that's important to understand that. And that faculty at a basic level may be completely neutral, but it stops being neutral when it gets to an extreme. But you need to specify the domain to measure it whatsoever. There's a quote here. This is page 13. There's a whole discussion in this paper about how they even set up these scales and how they differ from the way that Altmaier's had his set up. Both of these papers, by the way, the LWA ones, I'm going to link them in the description, but both the LWA papers agree that the RWA scale is a good measure of right-wing authoritarianism. They don't try to debate the RWA scale. What they try to do is they try to construct an LWA scale and show how much has been missed by the research that has almost entirely focused on RWA, supposedly. Ah, yes. Use parallel ideologically loaded scales to the degree that all words related to authoritarianism for both RWA and LWA are face valid measurements of authoritarianism. All words related to authoritarianism are essentially identical for both RWA and LWA. And 3, the only thing that varied across the scales is the type of authoritarianism submitted to. This is super important. Okay? When Altmaier constructed his LWA scale, and this is the stupidest thing that it's in all of this. He did not construct it with language that was symmetrical to the RWA scale. He didn't do it. This paper did it. Let me scroll down here to the very end where they actually show you the scales. So this is the LWA depoliticized, and RWA that they use in their studies. Our country desperately needs a mighty leader who will do what has become to destroy the radical traditional ways of doing things that are ruining us. Remember that? Remember that as symmetrical with what? With this. Our country desperately needs a mighty leader who will do what has to be done to destroy the radical new ways and sinfulness that are ruining us. So notice what they did. They took the RWA scale. They took all of the ideological stuff out of it because they shortened it down to 10 questions. Notice that I pointed that out. And then they left in all of the items that seem to trigger like have authoritarian language in them, or seem to trigger destroying other beliefs, like our country will be destroyed someday if we do not smash the perversions eating away at our moral fibers and traditional beliefs. The old-fashioned ways and old-fashioned values still show the best life, etc., etc. They basically took all of the generic questions in the RWA scale and flipped them. And what I can't fucking understand is how Altmaier didn't do that himself. How in the hell did you not think to do this? I actually don't know what his LWA scale looked like because I couldn't find it. But what's amazing is that he didn't do this. This literally, look, progressive ways and liberal values show the best way of life. Okay, the old-fashioned ways and old-fashioned values still show the best way of life. What our country needs is a strong-term leader who will crush evil and take us back to our true path. Okay? Let's take us back to our true path, signaling societal decline. What our country needs is a strong, determined leader who will crush the evil and pushy Christian religious people and turn us forward to a true path. This should say more like just traditional people. This Christian religious is a little bit too specific. But We should punish those who try to uphold what they claim are God's laws about abortion, pornography. Who try to uphold what they claim are God's laws about pornography. So, like, it's still pretty clear that all they did was they took the scale and flipped the language. They turned traditional into progressive, and they took items that said destroy new ways of thinking into destroy old ways of thinking. They said uphold traditional ways of thinking into upholding new ways of thinking. Like, so on and so forth. All they did was they flipped it. And that's the test that they used. And guess what? When they used this test, they found that there's people who score high in LWA. It's just amazing to me that Altmaier found nothing, because his questionnaire apparently only asks if you would support a revolution. Well, no fucking shit. People could answer these questions and not support a revolution. These questions don't ask you anything with regards to, like, violent upheavals, but they shouldn't, because neither did the RWA questions. The reason that this was omitted, that Altmaier didn't think to do this, is likely because of his own liberal bias, his own progressive bias about the idea of authoritarianism itself. He thought that the only way you could even be authoritarian on the left is if you supported direct violence, and not the mere idea of opposing traditional ways of thinking. But I'm here to point out that that's actually just not true. Whether you oppose old ways of thinking or new ways of thinking, authoritarianism can be implicit to both. Whether you are forcing people to change or forcing people to stay the same, you're forcing people in both cases. There's a complete symmetry with regards to this. I'm sorry, but there is. And it's weird because it feels like there isn't, right? It feels like, well, no, forcing people to change feels forcing people to stay the same feels authoritarian, because it's like you're forcing conformity, right? It depends. It depends on how you frame it. That's actually just a framing. Whether you're forcing conformity or you're forcing someone who has a certain way of living in their own house, in their own space, and you want to change them, and you're willing to punish them violently not necessarily, if you're willing to punish them and force them to change, even when they're not hurting anybody else, just by living the way that they live in their private space, and you're willing to go in there and change them, that's also authoritarian. That's also authoritarian. And it's especially the case because all that the right constantly argues is that they just want the left to leave them alone, right? This is why they argue that, because implicit in the activities of people that are wanting to change things is they also want to change people who don't want to change, and you could argue that one side is more authoritarian than the other only with regards to specific situations, with regards to specific scenarios and circumstances. You can't argue it in general, because in general it depends on the space and who has a right to what. If you're a left-wing person and you are in a left-wing space and someone's coming into your space and trying to get you to change, well, then you could argue that, yes, that person's an authoritarian. But if you do the same thing, that's also authoritarian. The biggest debate here is going to be whether it's even fair to flip the items. But I think it's absolutely fair, and it's just astonishing that so much of the research in this field has gone on believing in the RWA asymmetry, without even trying to measure for things symmetrically. It's kind of just astounding. Now, by the way, this goes back to my point that I started with. Whether you score high on one of these scales doesn't mean you're right or wrong. I don't care about that fundamentally. I'm trying to argue this from an ideologically neutral position, ideologically independent position as possible. I don't care if you have a high LWA score, low LWA score, right? Or high RWA score. You could be right and be high on RWA and high on LWA for all I fucking... the actual truth of things could be so complex none of us understand, right? But the point is, do not fucking tell me and do not tell anyone that there's some type of asymmetry in terms of authoritarianism. Just don't be saying that, because it's not true. You can clearly see, if you frame the questions in a flipped way, that people respond in a way that does seem to count as left-wing and authoritarian. It's just not authoritarian to the people who are in it. That's the real issue. People who are authoritarians don't feel that they're authoritarians, and left-wing LWAs are no different in this regard than RWAs. Frankly, I find both of them annoying. Oh, the other thing I want to point out, there's one small study, which study 8? Yes, this one. There's a study in here. So this paper just goes on. It looks at a bunch of studies that they did, like 12 different studies trying to measure LWA, trying to, you can read it in detail. I'm not going to get into all the details, but one of the studies they did was looking at people who score high in LWA and RWA, predicting their attitude towards African Americans and Jews, with the added criterion that the African Americans are Bible believing and the Jews are supporters of Israel, which apparently a lot of them are, according to the paper. It says like 90% of them are supporters of Israel. And what it finds is that high LWA people have a very negative opinions of Jews that are supporters of Israel and negative opinions of black people that are supporters that are Bible believing. And this is going to be a study that I can already tell left-wingers are going to despise. They're going to despise this study in particular, because this idea that like the left is racist is something they absolutely abhor. But I do see the point of it, because it's like they're not racist in the straightforward sense. They're not racist in a kind of honest but wrong sense where they have negative opinions of black people and Jews in principle. But they're racist in a kind of twisted sense, in that once you factor in the ideologies and positions that come along with being in that race or identity, then they become racist. This is what LWAs are like. Supposedly. They're not racist based on the abstract concept of a black person or a Jew that they have in their mind, but they're racist when they find out what these people are actually like, and when they catch wise of how a lot of Jews apparently support Israel, then they'll become anti-Semitic, or then they'll become... This is what the studies is sort of saying. Oh, by the way, here, this is zero order. This is block 2. This controls... This here is controlling for ideology. So notice, without controlling for ideology, the scores are higher, or they're more negative, and controlling for the ideology, they're less negative. Which makes perfect sense. You control for ideology, it offsets the scale to a degree. But yeah, the capacity for left-wing, I guess identitarian, not say identitarian violence, but identitarian, I guess left-wing identitarian exclusivism, because the thing with racism is an exclusionary ism. You know, you have a negative opinion of a different group. For the left, it's not in principle, but it's in reality, so to speak. That's going to be that's sort of the thing here. They don't have a negative opinion of the group based on their abstract conception of the group, but they have a negative opinion of the group based on what the group tends to actually believe. That's what this would be saying. Although I'm less, to be honest, the Bible-believing African-American men and women thing, I'm more skeptical of. The strong supporters of Israel thing, I'm 100% like, this I 100% buy, because I've seen it. I think a year ago when the Hamas attacks happened, and there was a whole lot of shit on the internet about pro-Palestine, anti-Palestine, pro-Israel people arguing. And this is exactly what you saw. Right, you exactly what you saw, and what people who were Jewish were saying was that, well, they were accusing people of being anti-Semitic. It's funny that, and the reason the left is going to hate this is because they think deep down their affirmation of diversity and love of all races is pure and real. But what this is actually saying is that that's not necessarily true, because that love for all races thing is based on a simplification of other races and identities. They are not actually being inclusive to all these other identities based on what those identities are in reality. In reality, meaning once you take not just people's skin colors, but their beliefs into account, the beliefs that tend to accompany these other identities and groups, then you're going to get negative opinions for certain kinds of beliefs. This is an interesting thing. It's interesting. It's like this is a form of racism that's hiding under the surface. It's not overt. This is why I think we have so much like a greater awareness of RWA than LWA, because all the shit that RWAs do is so obvious and on the surface. We know when right-wingers are being racist or anti-Semitic, it's plain obvious because they say things directly. They make direct affirmations of things that can be perceived as racism. But with left-wingers, nothing is direct. Everything is indirect. Everything is through this subterranean fucking, schema. It's only when you take a look at their beliefs of the group do they start to exhibit more kind of racist actions. So that's just interesting. I'm going to point that out. We're headed through this. Last thing I want to mention before we go to the last paper is just the difference between the number of authoritarians and the amount of authoritarianism. Both of these papers, the LWA papers, still try to make the claim, at the end, they try to make the claim that RWA is probably more of a threat to society than LWA. Both of the papers do this, despite, criticizing significantly Altmaier's work and trying to show that there's like a big kind of discussion of left-wing authoritarianism that's just not happening. Besides trying to, raise awareness to LWA, they do not make the claim that LWA is worse or even equal to RWA. They both make the claim that RWA is still likely worse overall. And here's the thing. I actually don't think that I agree with that. I'm actually not convinced that RWA is worse overall, because there's a difference between the amount of authoritarianism and the amount of authoritarianism. At the end of the day, you can have a society with tons of RWAs, but if the policies that are being enacted are policies that are being driven by LWAs, which one is having more of an effect? There's a difference between the number of believers or the number of personalities and the amount of effect itself, right? Because what's becoming clear from reading these papers is the fact that there seems to be a bias, a serious bias against the legitimation of the concept of LWA. The actual effect that the left might be having may be disproportionately high, even though there's few LWAs, in society, even if there's not that many of them, that's kind of the problem. It's like, even if you have, just imagine it in the context of like a classroom. Imagine half the students are right-wing authoritarians. No, not half. Imagine there's half the students are right, half the students are left. 10% of the students are right-wing authoritarians and 10% are, let's say 5% are left-wing authoritarians. The teacher, who is the boss, tries to make a decision based on what all the students want, but the teacher never listens to the 10% that are right-wing authoritarians. She always ignores them. She always just ignores those students because they're troublemakers. They punch other kids. They're horrible. But she always listens to the 5% that are LWAs. Well, the 5% that are LWAs might be having more of an effect on the policies and the structures of this overall class, whereas the 10% that are RWAs are being more excessively targeted and restricted by virtue of the establishment's understanding of both of these concepts. What's really important here to understand is that people's understanding of these concepts affects how we view the threat of authoritarianism in general, because this almost certainly offsets the threat of RWA and, heightens the threat of LWA. If LWA is a myth, and we're in, and it's been viewed as a myth for decades and decades, and people are only now starting to write about how maybe it's not a myth, the effect that it's having, and I think we all know that there is an effect that it's having, could be enormous. And by the time it's going to get to the point where the effect is something everyone's aware of, it might already be too late. That part is dependent. I'm not gonna really raise some type of alarm on this, but I'm trying to say is that it's not clear from any of the evidence that's present in these studies, at least, that RWA is more of a threat than LWA. All these studies show is how it correlates to all sorts of things. All these studies try to establish is what it measures. There is no measure whatsoever of which form of A exhibits the greatest threat to overall society. Altmaier himself never addresses this either, because we know Altmaier himself is looking at everything asymmetrically from presuppositions I've already established. are likely biased and false. I mean, you can point to all sorts of fucked up things that RWAs are doing, but if you're not accounting in the same window, noting all the excessive things that the LWAs are doing, how do you know who's actually, like, how do you know where the threat is coming from? You don't. And I'm just saying, like, I don't know. To me, it's really not obvious. I mean, sure, you have, people will point out all sorts of insane things like, oh, January 6th. January 6th is a huge event where the RWAs attacked the Capitol. And that's certainly true. And then you have Donald Trump, and that's certainly true. But then you also have millions of people protesting the George Floyd murder. And in that circumstance, you also see all sorts of political violence being done on the streets. How do you know that that doesn't add up to more? 20 million people went up to protest. And this paper, by the way, actually talks about that. It talks about how supporting those protests or participating in those, that LWA, the construct that they come up with, actually might predict behavior in those protests, which is another aspect of just legitimizing the measure. But yeah, so like, it's very clear it's not clear which form of authoritarianism is a bigger threat. And I think any type of argumentation on that front is pure speculation on the part of people being biased towards one direction or another. There's no piece of evidence. There's no piece of evidence about right-wing authoritarians doing X, Y, or Z that you can't, counter by having another piece of evidence about left-wingers doing A, B, and C. There's always another piece of evidence. The actual way of comparing the threats of these two forms of A is a completely different question that I don't think anyone's actually even begun answering, because we're not even at the fucking level of having a good sense of what authoritarianism is in the first place. Oh boy. Okay, the last paper. This paper is very complicated. What this paper does, unlike the previous one, it tries to construct a new left-wing authoritarian scale. It tries to, whereas this paper just took Altmaier's scale and flipped the language, this paper tries to construct a completely different scale based on new factors. This paper is sort of an exploratory investigation of what might define LWA and RWA in general. It's very interesting stuff. A lot of it's pretty complicated, and I actually don't know enough stats to... I didn't understand a good deal of the stats that go into this paper, because they do like regression analysis and stuff like that. So I'm not going to get into most of that. But it's a very interesting paper nonetheless. And what they came up with basically is that there are three factors, personality/ideological/psychological factors, that appear to correlate with, a good construct for LWA. And that is anti-hierarchical aggression, anti-conventionalism, and top-down censorship. Those are the three things that they found. And if you think about those three things, that makes basic sense to me. Whereas this paper just... The Altmaier scale is very kind of... The authoritarianism is generic. Yeah, like these questions are very kind of just generic, like do you oppose traditional or progressive ways of thinking? This paper tries to get into it from a more, like, it tries to dig very deep into what the kind of nomological core of what this construct is, if anything. Like somewhere deep within psychology, there are these factors that really determine how this type of behavior and this type of belief system work. And it's very interesting stuff. The anti-hierarchical aggression is obvious. Like, this is basically just believing in violence against the system. Looting, attacking buildings, and so on. Like, the belief that those in power should be punished, so on and so forth. Funnily enough, reflects the belief that those currently in power should be punished. Because once again, goes back to my point about symmetry, whether you believe that those who are in power should be punished or those who aren't in power should be punished, both of those are forms of aggression. Anti-conventionalism, which also makes sense, reflects a rejection of traditional values in favor of new values that we come up with in our progressive social groups. And top-down censorship, which is the use of government institutions to censor opposing views. obvious, right? That all three of these are here. This one especially should also probably correlate with RWA as well, to be honest. Let me get to the quotes that I wanted to discuss. This paper goes very deep into asking questions about cognitive rigidity and like openness and stuff like that. And I'm just going to make a few comments about how I think we should think about those things in the context of judging authoritarianism. Because individuals on the left are lower in conscientiousness, particularly the orderliness facet, it makes sense, and higher in openness than individuals on the right, we expect that the personality correlates of LWA would be more similar to SDO than RWA. Specifically, we predicted that LWA would be negatively related to conscientiousness, the intellect facet of openness, i.e. perceived intelligence and intellectual engagement, honesty, humility, agreeableness, positively related to the openness facet of openness, i.e. engagement with perceptual and aesthetic domains. I'm especially interested in this part. Negatively related to the intellect facet of openness, but positively related to the openness facet of openness. Why is this? Oh shit, I'm actually like covering most of it. There's the actual quote. Negatively related to conscientiousness and the intellect facet of openness, but positively related to the openness facet of openness. Why is this important? Because there's going to be people who will use certain things, certain phrases like, the right are more closed-minded and the left are more open-minded. But what this is saying is that they're open to the engagement of perceptual and aesthetic domains, but they're not open to intellectual engagement. They're not open to the intellectual facet of openness. Actual discussion of ideas or positions or stats that contradict their views, they're not open towards. This is true. And they're actually correct. Well, I think this is what they predicted, and I think this did turn out to be true. This makes perfect sense. And I just want to make the claim that when it comes to openness is not something that's necessarily even a good thing. This is another one of those things where there's a subtle, like, conventional bias with regards to certain things that influences our position. This, like, we think openness, open-mindedness is an intrinsically good thing, but no one thinks about the fact that there's such a thing as being too open. There is such a thing as being too open, just as there's such a thing as being too closed. Openness and closedness are not intrinsically asymmetrical cognitive traits. There's an implicit ideological bias even in that. And how do you know that there's a symmetry? Well, a simple fact is openness and closedness depends on openness and closedness to what? Openness is openness to what? It's openness to new information. If you define openness as openness to new information, okay, well then openness is clearly not better than closedness, because open to new information can mean openness to bad information. Because information can be good and bad, and there's a symmetry between good and bad, then there's a symmetry between openness and closedness. The bad thing about closedness is that you're closed to new information that's good. The bad thing about openness is that you're open to new information that's bad. And even if that's not the definition of openness, if openness just means you're open to all information, new and old, well then the problem is that you're not, then it's like you're holding all information at the same level, as if all information is equal. What if all information is not equal? You want to be closed to the information that's bad, and because you want to elevate the information that's good and lower the information that's bad. But being open to everything just acts as if everything's the same. The point is, there's an aspect of closedness that's just intrinsic to criticism itself. I can't tell you how many times people that I think are far too open would call me closed-minded or assume that I'm being closed-minded when all I'm doing is criticizing new information, and rather than just accepting it at face value. The problem I notice with people, because I interact with RWAs and LWAs, I can tell you that I think RWAs are people who are way too close-minded. Any new piece of information they just reject outright at first glance, and people who are too open just readily accept a new piece of information without thinking about it. And it becomes stupid, because what is even the point of having new information if you're not going to somehow scrutinize it or structurize it in accordance with pre-existing, known truths and beliefs? Openness in and of itself is not a good thing, because it can also go too far. Obviously, you need some amount of openness, but you need some amount of closedness, because the dialectic between openness and closedness is really the dialectic of logical, like rational determination and truth. It's the dialectic where you exclude information that's bad and include information that's good. You want there to be some closedness, some resistance, because that shows that you're applying your logic towards new information and not just accepting anything willy-nilly. That's a good thing, right? So that's just something to keep in mind. In the terms of these like psychological debates and so on, it's important to understand that a lot of these things, like openness, we feel that there's an asymmetry between them, but there may not be an asymmetry between them. RWA manifested large correlations with autocratic orientation, dogmatism, partisan moral disengagement, willingness to sign petitions advocating for A, federal prosecution of left-wing journalists, and B, the government to recognize far-left activist groups such as Antifa as terrorist organizations. See, here's the thing. This is an important thing to think about. While it's obviously going to be the case that RWAs are going to correlate with these things, whether these things are true actually depends on the conclusions we come to from these types of studies. If it seems like the government itself has a huge blind spot towards LWA, it doesn't take LWA as seriously as it takes RWA, then it is fair to say that the government ought to recognize far-left groups such as Antifa and so on. At the same time, it should prosecuting left-wing journalists if they're doing something wrong or illegal is also something it should do if there is, once again, this gaping blind spot towards LWA, which is present in these journalists, and they're not just LWAs with opinions, they're actually doing something illegal like libel or slander. I'm sure there's plenty of examples that people will point to. I can think of one example off the top of my head where it's not actually a journalist, but I think AOC said something about how Ted Cruz tried to have her murdered on Twitter. I don't know. I mean, that sounds like slander to me, or defamation at least. So that's just pointing things out like this. This belief in this will correlate with RWA, but it's not wrong simply because of that. Because belief in this might also logically follow from awareness of LWA as a construct. I think there's two more notes. I have a note here about cognitive fluidity versus cognitive rigidity. One of the things that this paper tries to measure is cognitive rigidity versus cognitive fluidity. I want to point out that cognitive rigidity, kind of like the openness, closedness thing, is also a thing that's symmetrical, like whether you're rigid or fluid. Because once again, it's not about being rigid or fluid, it's about being too rigid or too fluid. If you're too fluid, that's also a bad thing. Because if you're too fluid, you can't be pinned down on anything. I get that feeling reading Zizek, by the way. Reading Slavoj Zizek is like, I feel like someone like Jordan Peterson, if I could get him in a room, put my finger to his face and really peg him on specific things that he's getting wrong, he would probably admit to them. I don't know that Zizek would. I feel like Slavoj Zizek would twist and turn and try to get out of it with some psychoanalytical babble that no one understands besides weird psychoanalytical fucking philosophers. That's the impression I get from him. I haven't read that much Zizek, I might be wrong. But that's the impression I get, right? Too much fluidity can be a bad thing. And by the way, it depends how you define it, because once again, Bob Altmaier actually talks about how right-wing authoritarians have all these mental gymnastics for convincing themselves that they're not wrong. In a way that is a form of fluidity. It is a form of fluidity. It's fluid in how flexible it is and how flexile they are in their argumentation and in their ways of doing a dialectic. The rigidity is in their actual beliefs, but the fluidity is in their tactics. The same thing can be observed on the left. If you want to be sure that when you're talking about cognitive rigidity, you're talking about the simplification of the simplicity of their beliefs themselves, the simplicity of their schema, not the simplicity of their tactics. Their tactics can be fluid as fuck, and that's actually an annoying thing. This is one of the things that I notice about the people who I would call too cognitively fluid are that they can't be pinned down on anything, but the actual behaviors and the pattern that they're personalities and kind of behaviors follow is actually quite simple. Like they're not more complex as people because they're more fluid. The fluidity is just a habit that's kind of a tactic for skirting various forms of responsibility. And it goes back to the whole openness thing I said. Like if you're fluid, you're accepting what? You're accepting all sorts of definitions and concepts and notions and identities and so on. But what are you really doing with them? If you're just accepting them, you're not doing anything with them. If you're not doing anything with them, what meaning do they have? This goes back to what I'm saying is that there's a dialectic between new information and old information. Because there's a dialectic between taking like new information in life, information about events, histories, identities, and integrating that into an existing schema to build a larger kind of more encompassing ideology. But in order to do that, the ideology has to, you can't just be fluid because you actually have to structure things. You have to structure the new information with the old. But people who are overly fluid don't seem to do that. The narrative that they follow is very simple. It's very reductive, despite all of their fluidity. It's very reductive, and they don't like getting out of that reductivism. They like sitting in that, where they don't essentially have to think about anything. Maybe I'm not explaining that too well, but it's this cognitive rigidity thing. It really depends how they measure that. Maybe the way they measure it already accounts for what I just said, but fundamentally it's like, it's one of those things where, you know, I just want to make sure that people understand when you talk about people being rigid, you're not necessarily talking about people who act rigid or have beliefs that are rigid. You could have people that seem to have beliefs that are not rigid at all, that are completely flimsy, floppy, wavy, fucking like one of the ways that I can compare left-wingers and right-wingers that I think is a huge explanatory tool is right-wingers are like little like nuts. They're like tiny, like dense nuggets of just hardness that you cannot crack. They're like a tough ball of something very ultra dense made of iron that's heavy that you can't pick it up because it'll tear through the fucking ground and create a singularity. That's what right wingers are like. Left wingers, by contrast, are like air. They're like a gas. You try to capture them, they'll just fly away. That's what left wingers are like. Both of those forms are somewhat incorrect, right? Both of those forms are wrong. One of them manifests as over too much rigidity, and the other one manifests as too much fluidity. But both of them are bad because both of them are actually simplistic and both of them are reductive. The actual truth is not in being rigid or fluid, it's in the dialectic between them. And it's important to keep that in mind. I might have to talk about the fluidity rigidity thing later on because it's an interesting symmetry that's not obviously explained. The last thing I want to talk about, there's one more quote about communism and fascism. Do you see that in the thing? Okay. Yeah. The content of communism, however, is arguably humanitarian and anti... So they're arguing about different forms of authoritarianism, communism, and fascism, obviously. However, is arguably humanitarian and anti-authoritarian. Example, the ideological aims to remove economic inequalities, take care of individuals, put a doctrine from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs. In contrast, the content of fascism is wholly authoritarian. If this is so, individuals may initially be drawn to far left and far right authoritarianism for different reasons, with the hopes of eliminating injustices, even if they ultimately act in similarly authoritarian manners. This paper, I mentioned that they still take the position that the right-wing authoritarianism is more true to authoritarianism, even though left-wing authoritarianism is a bigger thing than we think. Both of these papers still claim that even though LWA is bigger than we think, RWA is still bigger than LWA. No such thing is true. And I'm going to address this communism versus fascism thing very quickly. As we have noted, you can see the screen. Yeah. As we have noted, communism and socialism, unlike fascism, propose humanitarian, egalitarian solutions to social injustices, which may attract individuals who hope to alleviate these injustices. Accordingly, left-wing authoritarianism may come to believe that authoritarianism is a necessary evil, rather than an end unto itself. Some individuals who score highly in LWA index may be well-intentioned idealists seeking to build a better and more equitable society by tearing down the establishment. Thus, any psychological similarities across LWA notwithstanding, we endorse no claim of motivational or moral equivalence or lack thereof across the two constructs at present. They make no... Okay, so to be fair, they make no claims of motivational or moral equivalence or lack thereof across the two constructs. I am absolutely claiming that there's a moral equivalence, though, between these two, despite this seeming asymmetry. There is asymmetry between communism and fascism. And it's not obvious because of precisely these kinds of arguments, because it feels humanitarian and egalitarian. So if it feels humanitarian, it can't be an evil, right? But that's the whole problem, is that the evil in communism is it's sinister because it doesn't feel like an evil. That's why it's bad. It's an authoritarianism that comes from a place of good, which is why it's so hideous, because it feels, when you're in it, when you're in that ideological lens, you feel like you're just doing the right thing, and you so deeply want to do the right thing that you actually end up doing the wrong thing because of how much everything's been twisted. But I also want to make the claim that it's actually not true at all that fascism isn't based on something that's humanitarian either. Maybe humanitarian isn't the right word, but fascism is fundamentally predicated on values that are human, right? I want to make that claim. And I realize that's probably unpopular and definitely something that a lot of people will disagree with, but I don't care. They're completely wrong. Fascism at its core, and this is the scary thing about it, just like communism, is based off of values that are fundamentally human and fundamentally, I would say, not morally objectionable. Fascism is just a desire, deep down at its inception, a desire for national or identitarian pride, but taken to an extreme. This harkens back to Hannah Arendt's thing of like, you can't reason with fascists because they don't believe in a common humanity, whereas communists do. And I understand why she thinks there's an asymmetry, but I completely disagree that there is one. Here's the reason. There is a common humanity even in fascism. The common humanity is in the desire for identitarian pride itself. It's the same common humanity that exists in any form of inegalitarian thought, in individualism. In any inegalitarianism, there is a form of common humanity because, so for example, in individualism, is there a common humanity? In individual inegalitarianism, the answer is yes, there is, because everyone's an individual. The common humanity is in the fact that only under individualism can each individual actualize themselves as much as they can in some sort of hierarchy. There's still a common humanity. The common humanity is just implicit in the fact that individuals are allowed to compete because they can't compete in a system where everyone's equal. Common humanity is in the equivalence of the individual's desire to compete in the first place. And in a system of inegalitarianism, but where that inegalitarianism is not based on individualism, but based on identity, identitarian based on group identity, and identitarian pride, it's the same thing. Well, it's the idea that you can't have real identitarian pride in a system where all identities are kept equal. Identitarian pride is only arrived at if identities are allowed to compete and be unequal. And fascism just takes that to an extreme of violence, just like communism. But I don't fundamentally see any difference. And I'm not saying this to try and defend fascism. I'm not. Fascism is hideous. I'm not saying this to elevate fascism. I'm saying this to lower communism down to fascism's level. Because I think it's fucking stupid and pretty disgusting that communism keeps getting away with all of the same criticisms that it deserves. It deserves to be perceived at the level of fascism. The Soviet Union deserves to be seen as the same thing as the Nazi Germany, but it isn't. Because of a lot of what appeared to be liberal biases at the level of research. So, it just gets to that point where, and I'm not saying that either of these things are good at all. I'm anti-fascist just as I'm, anti-communist, at least anti-communist in like the Marxist-Leninist sense, or the sense that it's communism has manifested. And communism in the works of theory is a completely different thing. But communism in practice, and yes, it's important to understand. See, My friend in who I discussed this shit a lot with was telling me how he thinks that there is an asymmetry between the left and right, but not at the extremes. I just think there's a symmetry between the left and right in general, and there's absolutely a symmetry between communism and fascism. So this extra humanitarian aspect of communism is not something that necessarily means there's an asymmetry or less equivalence. No, because fascism comes from originally a desire for identitarian pride, national pride, ethnic pride, some other pride. I mean, depends on which form of fascism you're talking about technically. I think with the Nazis, it was more about racial pride. With the Italian fascists, it was more about national pride, but who cares? The point is it's about identitarian pride, and identitarian pride is fundamentally a thing that every identity wants, and the common humanity is in permitting the actualization of that want, right? And that's the underlying value structure that gives way to the inegalitarian forms of value that fascists have. Of course, what we call fascism doesn't start there. Doesn't end there. It takes that to an extreme that is boosted and reinforced by all sorts of insecurities and fear of other races and all of this other, artificial shit. But the actual underlying value is no different and no less moral than the underlying value that the communists and socialists have. And I will debate anyone on that fucking topic till I fucking die, because it's enough is enough that we still think that there's a fucking asymmetry between these things. My God. Oh boy. We're 2 hours in. I mean, this is basically all I want to mention. I'm gonna link both these articles in the description. Take a read. Take a cursory glance at them. At the very least, this stuff is interesting. I really hope that these LWA papers start getting more recognition in the future. I really hope that people start talking about LWA more, because from the looks of it, it appears to be like LWA is like grotesquely ignored within the literature, within the science, within the field. And and it's just disappointing, because I feel like it's very easy not to ignore this stuff. Like, look at all the theoretical stipulations and points of nuance that I've raised in this 2-hour video. All of these things that I've mentioned are things that the researchers should have been thinking about, and it just seems like they're not, and that's bad. And and I think this field will ultimately move forward as more people start being aware of all the different like dialectical splits that really matter when measuring authority, all the different dialectical symmetries that matter when measuring any type of authoritarianism. Anyway, thanks for watching. Merry Christmas. Enjoy the rest of the year. And I'll see you in 2022. Cheers.